Moseley Family Cemetery in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, 2014. During a $346 million Microsoft data center expansion in 2014, developers discovered a historic African-American cemetery belonging to the Moseley family. Despite initial archaeological assessments deeming the site eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, efforts were made to downplay its significance. The cemetery was eventually excavated, and the remains of 37 individuals were reinterred elsewhere, often without notifying descendants. It began like any other construction job: hard hats, steel machines, and the slow churn of red Virginia clay, giving way to progress. In the spring of 2014, the sleepy town of Boydton in Mecklenburg County was about to witness transformation. Microsoft, the tech giant, had chosen this rural stretch of land for a $346 million expansion of its East Coast data hub. Local newspapers buzzed with optimism. Elected officials shook hands for cameras. A new era, they called it. Jobs were promised. Roads were being repaved. The hum of diesel engines became the new morning song. But beneath that ground, silent and undisturbed for nearly a century, history waited. One morning, as a backhoe carved through a section of dense soil, the bucket struck something that didn't crunch like stone. The operator paused, confused. At first glance, it looked like shattered wood, rotted, dark, splintered. Then came a glint of metal, a handle, a plaque, and just beneath it, something pale. Bone. The site manager ordered a halt. Within hours, archaeologists arrived, boots crunching over disturbed earth. They moved carefully, brushing away layers of soil as if unwrapping a secret. What they found sent a chill through the team. The outline of a coffin, and then another, and another. Soon they uncovered a headstone, tilted, cracked, but still legible. Stephen Moseley, born 1865, died December 3, 1930. Near it lay a smaller, crumbling marker, Fred Moseley, 1906, 1906. It didn't take long to determine that this was no ordinary burial site. This was a family cemetery, a black family cemetery, hidden by time, forgotten by history, and now sitting directly in the path of one of the largest data center expansions on the East Coast. For the archaeologists, it was a moment of reverence, a chapter of the past uncovered. But for some behind the scenes, those managing budgets and construction timelines, it was something else entirely, an obstacle, one that needed to disappear. Word spread quickly among project officials. What had started as a mere construction delay was now a legal and ethical minefield. Federal law was clear. When human remains or historic sites are discovered during federally involved development, a process must follow. Archaeological assessments, historical surveys, public notices, and perhaps most critically, consultation with descendants. Mecklenburg County officials, Microsoft representatives, and hired consultants gathered behind closed doors. Time was money, and this project was already running on an unforgiving clock. Each day of delay meant more costs and more attention. The archaeologists submitted their initial findings. The evidence was strong, and their conclusion firm. This was a historically significant African-American cemetery, likely tied to generations of black residents who had lived and labored in Southside Virginia, many of them during Reconstruction and Jim Crow. That meant the cemetery was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The recommendation: halt all development in that area, protect the site, preserve the memory. But almost immediately, the resistance began. A consultant named Alexis Jones, hired by Enviro Utilities on behalf of the county, challenged the findings. "How do we know these were black graves?" she asked in a closed meeting. Her suggestion, echoed by a few others, perhaps these were poor white tenant farmers. Maybe it wasn't so clear after all, but it was. Historical burial patterns were well documented in the South. During the Jim Crow era, black and white communities did not bury their dead together, especially not in rural areas like Boynton, where segregation wasn't just law, but daily life. An independent archaeologist weighed in, reaffirming the original conclusion. There's no question, this is a black cemetery and it deserves protection. Still, the pressure mounted. Phone calls were made, reports were revised, and slowly, quietly, the language began to shift. The site, once described as historically significant, was now being labeled a possible burial ground, an inconvenience, a footnote. Meanwhile, no one had told the Mosley family. Descendants were alive and well, some living just minutes from the site. One of them, Mike Mosley, was a staff writer at the Mecklenburg Sun, the local newspaper. Another, David Mosley, was a retired educator in his 80s who still remembered stories of the old cemetery tucked between pines and tobacco fields. But neither man had received a phone call, no knock at the door, no letter, and yet, deep in the legal classifieds of the Sun, a small notice had been published, formal notification of intent to relocate graves, buried in plain sight. The silence was intentional, and the ground, still unsettled, had more secrets left to tell. The skies turned gray over Mecklenburg County, as if mirroring what was unfolding underground. Despite protests from archaeologists, and without meaningful contact with any known descendants, the county moved forward. Officially, the decision was couched in procedure. State law allowed reburials after a legal notice, and they had posted one in a one-column ad in the classified section of the Mecklenburg Sun. Tiny font, no headline, no mention of the name Mosley. To the casual reader, it was just another routine announcement, one of many. To the family, it might as well have been a ghost. In private, a permit was secured for exhumation. A contractor was hired, and the unmarked cemetery, once shrouded in trees and memory, was transformed into a work site. It began quietly, before dawn on a weekday, with no press and no family present. Workers donned gloves and boots, stepping through wet clay and leaning over partially collapsed caskets. Some of the remains were so fragile they dissolved in the mud. Rain came hard that week, soaking the ground and turning the burial site into a mire. But there was no delay. The schedule had to be kept. One by one, the graves were opened, 37 individuals lifted from their resting place, some fully intact, others reduced to fragments. Among the artifacts recovered were coffin nails, rusted handles, a pair of eyeglasses, epitaph plaques, and a small, smooth ivory comb, likely carried in a woman's pocket or laid gently in her casket by someone who loved her. There were no prayers, no ceremony, no names spoken aloud. The remains were placed into temporary containers and loaded onto a truck. They were headed for a reburial site in a nearby town, technically still within the county, but far removed from the original land the Mosley family had once called their own. There, in 4 newly purchased plots, the remains were buried again. No tombstones, no markers, just a clerk's entry in a file that read, "Assorted bones." The county had completed its duty. Legally, The boxes were checked. But in the silence left behind, in the empty space where headstones once stood, questions still lingered. Who were they? Who did they leave behind? And who gets to decide whose history is worth preserving? Weeks passed. The earth was smoothed over. Gravel was laid. The hum of machinery returned to the site, louder than ever. Microsoft's expansion resumed like nothing had happened, like no one had been there before. But history has a way of resisting silence. In a quiet office at the Mecklenburg Sun, reporter Mike Mosley scanned the paper's recent editions, flipping through classifieds without knowing what he was about to find. His eyes paused on a small legal ad from weeks prior, vague, bureaucratic, and yet unsettling. He read it again and again. Then he felt it in his chest. The Mosley Cemetery. He stared at the page, frozen, unable to understand how he, a Mosley, a journalist, a descendant of those very people, had never been told. No one had called. No one had asked. Across town, David Mosley, 85 years old and full of stories passed down like family heirlooms, sat in his home surrounded by faded photographs and memory. When Mike called him, his voice trembled, not with age, but with disbelief. "They moved them?" he asked. The news dropped like stone. The cemetery he had visited as a child, the place his father had pointed to from the edge of a tobacco field, gone, dismantled, bulldozed, without ceremony, without dignity, without a word. He remembered the names, Stephen, Fred, others who had toiled in fields, survived Reconstruction, endured segregation. Their lives had meant something. Their place in the land was earned, carved with sweat and struggle, and now erased. Mike began digging. He searched county records, reread archaeological reports, called historians. What he found was a trail of decisions made quietly, legally, but with deliberate avoidance. Reports were softened, warnings dismissed. The evidence that could have halted the project had been minimized, redirected, and buried, just like the people at the heart of it all. For the Mosley family, it was more than a loss. It was theft, not just of graves, but of history. The kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that disappears if no one is watching, the kind that happens when those with power choose to forget and hope everyone else does too. But Mike Mosley wasn't going to forget. He had a voice, and the silence was about to break. Mike Mosley was no longer just writing the news. Now, he was part of it. With decades in journalism, he knew how to follow a lead. But this was personal. Every sentence he typed weighed heavier than the last. This wasn't a scandal about politics or development. This was about his blood, his family, his ancestors, and how they'd been quietly erased. He reached out to state preservation offices, asked why no one had contacted the family. The answers came back cold, wrapped in legal language and vague references to process. The decision to relocate the remains had followed the letter of the law, they said. A public notice had been issued, the proper forms filed. But Mike knew the truth. What's legal isn't always right. And burying a family without telling them wasn't just a clerical oversight, it was cultural erasure. He started to document everything, the archaeological findings, the county's internal emails, the names of the consultants who had cast doubt on the cemetery's identity. He wrote not as a reporter for a sleepy county paper, but as a witness, a descendant, a protector of the past. And slowly, quietly, others began to listen. Independent researchers reached out. African American historians started to take notice. Cemeteries like Mosley's weren't isolated cases. They were part of a larger pattern across the South. Black burial grounds paved over, built upon, or forgotten. Time and again, communities were displaced in life and now even in death. But the Mosleys had a voice now. David Mosley, though aging and soft-spoken, began speaking to anyone who would listen. He told them about the land his family once lived on, about the funeral stories passed down through generations, about the headstones he once stood before. He cried when he learned they were gone. When asked if he had been offered the chance to see the new reburial site, he shook his head. "No one ever asked," he said. The new graves were unmarked. There was no indication that 37 individuals lay beneath the soil. Just grass, a few trees, and a file in an office that referred to them as assorted bones. Mike's reporting, once ignored, began to spread. First locally, then regionally. Eventually, it reached journalists beyond the county, people who saw in this story something larger, something painful and old and still very alive. The past had been buried, but it wasn't going to stay that way. By the time the public finally learned what had happened, the backhoes were long gone. The construction was finished. Microsoft's new servers hummed silently atop what had once been the resting place of generations. Sleek, modern infrastructure now stood where wooden crosses and worn headstones once marked lives lived through hardship, love, and quiet dignity. The company issued no press release. No plaque was placed at the original site. There was no ceremony. The land gave way to progress, and the story might have ended there, unnoticed. But it didn't, because Mike Mosley wouldn't let it. His reporting, joined by national investigations, gave the Mosley Cemetery a second life, not in the ground, but in the public conscience. Articles exposed how historic black cemeteries were systematically overlooked. Historians began mapping lost burial grounds across the country. Families, once silent, began asking questions, looking at old deeds, following stories in the dirt. But for the Mosleys, no amount of press could undo the loss. There was no going back to the wooded land where Stephen and Fred had once rested. No way to rebuild the fragile, broken caskets. No way to return what was taken in the name of advancement. David Mosley, once a boy who stood beside his father in that quiet cemetery, now stood by new graves, unmarked, unfamiliar. He placed flowers anyway. "This is still their ground," he said softly, "even if nobody else says it is." Mike walked the new site in silence. He carried a binder filled with notes, articles, and emails. His family story in pieces. He left it on his desk that night with a handwritten note on the first page. "They may have been buried twice, but we will not forget them again." And in that promise, something shifted. Not justice, not restoration, but memory. And sometimes memory is the first form of resistance, because history isn't only what we build, it's what we choose to remember.